А сегодня профессор Кэмп представит доклад о озеленении денежно-кредитной политики. Почему, когда, где? Прошу вас.
Большое спасибо за представление. Да, мне разрешено голосовать или нет, не знаю. По этому вопросу, который вы...
I get that, yes, but I get that everybody knows.
Ну, я так понимаю, все знают мой ответ. И с учетом моего интереса и заинтересованности в этой теме, которая как раз и заключается в ответе на вопрос, нужно ли нам озеленять денежно-кредитную политику. В целом, я хочу изложить в своем выступлении то, что в конечном итоге глобальное потепление который представляет собой расстройство климата больших масштабов. Вопрос не просто температуры, вопрос того, что идет под откос вся система климатическая с огромными эффектами, затратами для среды, экономики. И мы, наконец, осознаем теперь те риски, которые связаны с выбросами СО2, углекислого газа. Это особенно справедливо в отношении властных кругов, и включая Центральный банк. И сейчас уже центральные банки тоже начинают осознавать эти вещи. И начинают думать об этом, но не очень сильно действовать, противодействовать. В этом содержание моего выступления. Я хочу поговорить о том, что делают в отношении, и почему это глобальное потепление, и как это расстройство климата влияет на то, как работает денежно-кредитная политика и влияет на экономику. Но в основном тезис мой такой, что банки центральные должны больше делать монетарной политики. И банки должны свою долю вклада внести в противодействие глобальной потепления. И чтобы достичь этой цели, потепление не больше на 1,5 градуса к концу века. Я думаю, что чтобы мы смогли это сделать, я предлагаю некоторые варианты для банков. И в рамках денежно-кредитной политики они могут изменить поведение без того, чтобы подвергать опасности и риску достижения основных целей, в рамках которых они работают, поддержание номинальных определенных показателей. Вы знаете, что центральный банк в любой развитой стране действует в целом автономно от органов власти. Но также верно, что центральных банков большая зона ответственности, начиная с кризиса 2008 года, сейчас пандемия. Но есть и третий риск для нашей социально-экономической системы. Это глобальное потепление. И вопрос состоит в том, может быть, выглядит несколько странным, но центральные банки их осознание связано во многом с выступлением управляющего Центрального банка Англии Марка Карни, когда он предупредил финансовое сообщество в целом. Климатические изменения несут риски для финансового сектора, финансовой индустрии. И включая, так сказать, деятельность центральных банков. И принцип Карни, как я его называю, который как бы исходит из этого выступления, вот к тому, что на самом деле имеют право центральные банки действовать против изменения климата. Потому что в конечном итоге эффекты, они должны работать против тех эффектов, которые создаются изменением климата. И управляющий Маккартни сказал, есть три риска, три типа рисков, которые надо учитывать. Первое – это физические риски, что изменение климата приносит новые риски, и поэтому изменяет ожидаемые уровни прибыльности финансовых агентов. В портфеле, конечно, это существенный очень имеет для финансовой организации. Но есть еще и риски перехода. Касающиеся финансовой индустрии. Связанные
economic agents under the pressure of public policies in particular. So we are probably too slowly, but we are transitioning to a new type of productive strategies, which are low carbon strategies. And we are getting out of oil and coal and to a lesser extent gas. And that creates also that this transition process creates also risks. But there are also, and that was interesting and surprising, and Governor Carney mentioned the liability risks, the fact that more and more individuals or agents or firms or organizations, non-governmental organizations will sue companies, firms, or governments for not acting sufficiently against global warming and therefore putting in danger their own life or their own activities. And these legal actions will entail costs, will entail punishments, and these punishments will also have a financial impact. For these three reasons, it is necessary, according to Governor Carney, to act for financial actors, including central banks. Okay, and but the Carney principle is in some ways incomplete or too vague. It is only associated with the risk of financial instability, but it is not addressing the core business of a central bank, which is the conduct of monetary policy. And moreover, Governor Carney was basically silent on how to tackle by financial actors and central banks, how to tackle the global warming issue. Banks did act following 2015 and the Paris Agreement, and that's good. That's good, but it's clearly insufficient. There is by now the initiative of the Banque de France. There is a central banks and supervisors network for greening for the financial systems. It was created in 2017, and by now it has more than 40 members. I should have checked whether the Bank of Russia is part of this system. But anyway, that network is quite active in increasing the sensitivity of monetary policymakers to global warming. In particular, the Bank of England is interesting because actually by now there is a senior executive responsible at the highest level of the Banque de France, of the Bank of England, which is responsible for the climate risks and following the initiatives taken to tackle these risks. So on the whole, it's good, but it is insufficient. It is insufficient, and basically there are reluctances to act at the level of central banks against global warming. And here, the governor of the Banque de France recently expressed this reluctance. He said, basically, and that is quite sensible, and the objection is quite reasonable. He said, basically, we must remember the ultimate objective of monetary policy. It is designed to achieve macroeconomic objectives and not sectoral objectives. In other words, the worry of the French governor is that it is not in the realm of a central bank to act against global warming. Why that? Because to fight global warming necessarily has some macroeconomic significance, and basically it is supposed to support low carbon emitting industrial sectors or productive sectors, and to hinder the development of high carbon or carbon intensive industries and sectors. And the French governor says it's not the tasks of a central bank to intervene into industrial matters, because basically we have solely macro objectives, and we should be neutral with respect to industry, and we should not favor any type of sector or agents at the detriment to other sectors. It is correct, but it is not an objection which is sufficient. First, because by now we know that central banks, actually, whether they know it or not, are not neutral. And we know that by now they support some sectors to the detriment of others. And this is true with the pandemic, for example, and the massive injection of liquidity has benefited shareholders at the detriment of wage earners, and more precisely to the detriment of the poor. So there is a distributive issues related to monetary policy. But in addition, actually, it is now known that the massive support of and creation of liquidity by the central banks have favored de facto carbon intensive industries. So basically, this is not the objection is not sustainable. So I think for these reasons, and I will develop that, it's high time to green monetary policy. So let's come to let's be more precise, and let's see what are the links between monetary policy and climate, global warming or climate change. Well, as usual, when you have an and, there are two ways to express this and. The flow, the arrow can go from climate change to monetary policy. How climate change is impacting monetary policy and the central bank's mission. The other arrow is to look in the reverse and see how monetary policy could contribute to global warming or the reduction of global warming, to be more precise. So for central bankers have been much more willing to tackle the first arrow, the first causal link, climate change impacting monetary policy, than they have been to look at the second link, which is how monetary policy could contribute to the reduction in global warming. It is very true that global warming is impacting monetary policy because it affects, so in a nutshell, for two reasons. There are new shocks due to global warming. Global warming is a shock. It generates higher external shocks. Global warming, the impact of global warming can be assessed. They can be precisely forecast because global warming is a highly non-linear process on which we have very few information and experience. So it's for sure there is more shocks. And second, and they are highly non-linear, well, unexpected. It's hard to expect them and to anticipate what will come. They are extreme, meaning that they create havoc on an economy or a society. Okay, it's not just a sort of business cycle shock coming out from, I don't know, some variation in the oil price, for example. It's much more than that. And second reason is that the transmission channels of monetary policy are modified. So basically, climate change creates new risks, and in particular, new disruptions. They also modify the transmission channels because some sectors are more affected than others by global warming. For example, I don't know, let's consider that there will be an increase in the sea level, and that would create new risks for industries located on the shores because they are now subject to more flooding. Same with the agriculture. Some industries, some agricultural sectors or productions will suffer. Maybe some will benefit. But for these reasons, you understand that the transmission channels have been affected. More precisely, because there will be, it's likely that there will be more black swan events, okay? Very extreme catastrophic events which are at a low probability of occurrence, okay? Therefore, another reason why there is a problem is that actually the environment within which a central bank acts becomes much more uncertain, okay, and much more non-linear. The problem is that all these risks and structural modifications, are likely to interfere with the standard monetary objectives of monetary policy, which is basically, if I may remind you of that, to control monetary magnitudes. Okay, so to conclude, this part is it cannot be denied by no one that monetary policy is affected by climate change, which generates two puzzles. Basically, can we still talk about monetary neutrality? Okay, basically, is it true that the central bank is neutral insofar as the real economy is concerned? It has been a motto, a very standard, very simple motto for economics to consider and discuss monetary non-neutrality, whether it was true in the short term or true in the long term. The standard consensus that there is monetary neutrality in the long term, but not in the short term. Well, that consensus is to be challenged because it's likely that now there is no more long-term neutrality because of global warming. And then the second issues riddle is whether monetary policy should act again or react to these modifications. Should it act quickly and fastly, or should it take time to consider and act or react slowly? Okay. But up to now, monetary policy has not been discussed insofar as its conduct has not been discussed. It is the second leg of the discussion. And here, I would like to put to the fore and plead for the claim that monetary policy and therefore central banks should actively be involved against global warming. First, because as we have seen before, they are not neutral, even microeconomically or sectorally, okay? And moreover, actually, it is possible for central banks to act through their monetary policy against global warming without to put in danger their main objective, which I do not deny or discuss, which is the control of nominal magnitudes, in particular the control of inflation, because we know that price variabilities and uncertainties and linked to inflation are very dangerous factors which create high risks for the real economy. So I think that it is possible for a central bank to modify its monetary policy decision without modifying so much the process through which or by which monetary policy is implemented. Okay, so I do not challenge the position of a central bank and its action with respect to financial markets and in particular to short-term monetary markets. I do not challenge its role with respect to commercial banks. I'm just saying that the common framework for conducting monetary policy with respect to commercial banks and financial markets at large can be slightly modified slightly modified so as without structural change, so as to support low carbon transition. Okay, there are two. I remind you that there are two instruments at the end of a central bank. It's the money market interest rate first, and it's the collateral assets that that the central bank accepts in return for its supply of liquidity to commercial banks. And I think that the working of these and the putting in place of these two instruments can be slightly modified to take into account whether the borrowers intermediated by commercial banks are low carbon intensive industries or agents or high carbon intensive agents. Okay, and basically in a nutshell, I will not develop the techniques that I offer, it is developed in a paper published in a French journal, but there is an English version which I can make available to anyone who is interested in the issue.
Я прошу извинения, можно я на секунду прерву?
I apologize. Can I interrupt you for 1 second, just for one clarification?
Yes.
Uber, I have one question. You are now talking, do you have a presentation, slides, or you don't have it? We just have a feeling that you have a presentation, but you're just not showing it to us. Do you have it?
No, I do not.
Хорошо, тогда мы наслаждаемся, не отвлекаемся.
Okay, no problem then. We are not going to be distracted by this. Okay.
No. I have no slides if that is what you mean. Basically,
that's exactly what I was asking.
But I have a written text corresponding to the conference that I'm giving now, and I have a longer text which corresponds to the article developing the suggestions and the mechanisms that I advocate for altering monetary policy. It is this or these two documents, the short one and the long one, can be made available to you if it is needed or requested. Did I answer your question?
Спасибо.
Yes.
Да, спасибо.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so basically, the idea of my proposal is based on a very simple mechanism, which is well known by economists. I'm not inventing a solar system. It is just a bonus-malus approach. Okay, there should be in the loan contracts made by the central bank with commercial banks, there should be positive or negative premia based on the involvement of commercial banks in the carbon intensity of their customers. It's basically that. So introduce some premia into the direct interest rate put in place by a central bank, introduce premia where in the discount price at which a collateral is accepted by a central bank, depending on the carbon intensity of that collateral. That's all. That's basically, in a nutshell, the argument that I propose. So it's time for me to conclude. So let us remind you that global warming is by definition global. No one of us is spared by global warming, not even Russia. There should be no mistake. Russia is not immune to global warming. Russia will suffer both from the north, its northern part, and its southern part. So it is, global warming is massive, persistent, highly inertial, creeping up. That's a danger. We don't see it day after day. It's creeping up at a very low pace, but it is there and it will have massive consequences. For that reason, everybody should be involved in the fight against global warming, that is, in the fight against using fossil fuels, including central banks. But monetary policy, whatever central bankers claim, is still conducted independently from climate concern. This must change, according to me. It's possible to do that. The various arguments in favor of inaction are inadequate, okay? So it is possible, very simply, without putting in danger the role of a central bank in an economy, which is short-term, I agree on that. It is possible by slightly modifying the instruments that it uses to contribute to the fight against global warming. It doesn't mean that central banks should do much or all of it. Most of it should be made by other public institutions under the pressure of non-governmental organizations, because we are very sure that policymakers prefer not to act than act, okay? And not to modify too much structurally the system they are steering than putting in place policies which generate forcibly losses and transitional costs. That being said, so I'm not claiming that the central bank should take the lead role against global warming. I'm just saying that it should take its share of the fight against global warming, and that is possible. It is particularly important, okay, because of what the central bank has become in our economies and societies, okay? They have become basically lighthouses. They are prominent public authorities with a lot of credibility due to the fact that that may be a weakness, but in terms from the public opinion point of view, it is a strength because of its independence from political pressures. Therefore, given that it has a high credibility profile, if a central bank publicly makes clear that it is acting against global warming, that would be central to convince the public opinion that definitely global warming is important. So there is a second advantage of a pro-climate monetary policy, which is more societal than strictly economical. It is that it will accelerate the consideration by all of us of the urgency to act against global warming. And I think that it's time for me to stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you ever so much for your great presentation and lecture. And now I would like to try to demonstrate what were the results of the voting that everyone took. And just give me a second for that. Can you see the answers, colleagues? Yes, we can see it. Wonderful. So the question was whether central banks should conduct green monetary policies, and you were advised to choose not more than 3 options for an answer. Most of you who voted were able to vote, despite our technical difficulties, think that yes. And the main argument is that climate change does impact economic growth, employment, and inflation, which influences the monetary policy and therefore has to be taken into account by the central banks in conducting their policy. But there is also a group of reasons why we have to treat this with caution. Most of our colleagues expressed the feeling that climate change and climate policy is the responsibility of the government, and therefore central bank should maintain its independence. These are the key results of the voting. And right now, colleagues, we are ready to start a discussion. Before I give the floor to our participants, very respectable participants, as a non-expert in central banks or climatology, I would like to say a couple of things. Many questions arise in connection with this. The first question is whether monetary policy should have any green elements. Number two, should central banks somehow participate in what's associated with the greening of monetary policy? And what I'm concerned about is that I'm not a climate expert, but I have a feeling that they have not yet reached an agreement between each other. Yes, most of them are talking about trends associated with global warming, but I'm just concerned that maybe very soon those opinions may change 180 degrees. And then another question is to what extent we should be ahead of other parties concerned. What are the benefits that we may derive out of this? Because of course there are certain long-term expectations and we need to move in that direction. And yet we have short-term and medium-term losses that our economy might incur. How can we minimize those costs? And in order to do that, should we be in the avant-garde of this, or maybe we should be in the rear guard? The majors are not really planning to be involved in this. Should we be amongst the trailblazers? That's all I had. That completes my introduction. And now I would like to give the floor to Oleg Vyugin, Professor, Department of Economic Sciences at National Research University High School of Economics, a person who represents the financial world and feels this quite well. You have more than just 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. It is with great interest that I heard the presentation. The question that Professor Kemp has raised have no specific answers yet. Speaking about the role of central banks, a dual role, even it's with active policies of central banks. Number one is inflation. No decisions by central banks should lead and affect the ability of the central bank to control the inflation. And the second thing, which is key, is that the risks for the financial system, for the investors. Because the mission of the central bank, despite the fact that the global warming and the greening are powerful issues, but the mission of the central bank, which at least includes these two anchors, cannot be challenged or doubted, I think, probably. But what I've heard, I can partially agree with, that the central banks may contribute to the general movement of greening the economy through monetary policy instruments. This may include attempts of central banks not to treat in the same way the borrowers. The central banks do not issue directly loans, but through commercial banks that can have a differentiated approach and treatment. And the question about the treatment to the collateral related to green projects or provisioning of funds related to loan risks. These are open issues and there's a discussion underway. Commercial banks are today raising this question. Issue. For green loans, separated in terms of money flows, they are subject to special analysis by commercial banks and central banks. The level of risk assigned by the central bank to such loans it can, in the green projects, for them, the level of risk assigned can be reduced. And the most important thing that the central bank is not to affect its mission of controlling inflation, but indirectly, this will incentivize flows of loans from traditional projects to green projects. A great role can be played by central banks. They can use non-loan instruments by issuing bonds and green bonds for the Russian central bank. It is a specific instrument and mechanism that the central bank is trying to develop in the European markets, in developed markets. The volumes are trillions of dollars of such bond issues, facilitating and financing green projects. That's a place where central banks can play a substantial positive role. But greater weight, it's true, is on the part of the government, executive government, where they could provide subsidies and other instruments and mechanisms that can softly affect this change of flows from traditional sectors in favor of green projects. This is what can be realistically done, and I think the central bank will follow this path, and that's probably what the presenter was speaking about. I could add a few things, but it's enough to trigger a discussion. Thank you very much. It has been just said that the Russian central bank has already come up with some initiatives. We are having with us Alexei Zavodkin, the deputy chairman of the Bank of Russia. Perhaps you could say a few words about the possible role of the central bank, what is being done. 5 minutes for you. Cannot hear you, unmute your mic. Thank you very much. I may exceed 5, maybe to 6 minutes. Thank you very much for inviting me to this discussion. Very interesting indeed. My comments are very much in resonance with what Oleg Yugins has just said, because overall, the important points have been mentioned. I will focus on monetary policies. The environmental agenda is impacting and will be more and more aggressively impacting the financial system, and there is no doubt about it. I agree with Professor Kemp, and the book that he mentioned is the best, probably. I recommend it. And the environmental agenda generates a new set of risks that were not previously taken into account by regulators or banks, central banks. And the purpose and task of central banks as protectors of financial price stability is to adequately consider and take into account these new risks. For those impacts would not affect too much price stability. Yes, we are a member of NGFS that Professor Kemp has mentioned. He's actively pursuing this agenda. There is a task force, a working group. Co-chairs are regularly meeting. The important track is multifaceted analysis of risk and their impact on the risk and the stability of financial intermediaries, and adequate regulation for these risks should be taken into account the risk management and the prudential oversight in provisioning creation that was mentioned by Oleg Yugin. 3 difficulties and challenges is long horizon for risk implementation, which are much longer than standard risk in the credit analysis. Credit analysis is about 3, 4, 5 years maximum. With climate risk, we're talking about a horizon which can be decades. And the second challenge, and probably the main challenge, is absence of comparable historical data which statistically could be extrapolated in terms of qualitative assessment of risk. And the third challenge, even climate scientists have some divergence of opinions about how the situation will develop. Yeah, the issue is there. The problem and the question is about the scale. There's a whole gamut and set of scenarios about climate changes and the expected response of policies across the world. That complicates analysis. Adjacent tracks, an assessment of climate agenda impact on financial stability microeconomically. The role of fossil fuel, which is characteristic of Russia for such economies, that's of great significance because we are starting from a more brownish start. And this will involve greater difficulties in transition. And going to this present discussion about the monetary policy as such, my major comment perhaps is based, it's quite proper to speak about green financing and measures to develop it, but it's not necessarily proper to speak about green money or some other color money. Even if there's a target in investment and financing by the government, by the moment they go into wages and salaries, they lose their colors and become part of the overall money mass. And quite often we hear proposals about the key policy rates, collateral assessments, choosing assets in qualitative easing. They are voiced not only with regard to climate agenda, even on less significant matters and issues. All of these ideas have been very much activated during the past 2 years, where we saw the policies of central banks has gone into some non-traditional ways. Nevertheless, we have this firm position, all the money in the economy is the same, and this sameness is the essence of the monetary policy of central banks. And they should not create redistributive effects in the economy, but only macroeconomic stability. Professor Kemp said that we have deviated from this approach recently, pursuing non-standard policy. Only time will show the long-term effects of such digressions or division. The role of central banks has gone up significantly in macroeconomic policy. As Professor said, they became even greater, larger beacons of light in this complicated situation economically in the world. But the question is to what extent it is justified. Our central banks go outside of what is to their capability without challenging or putting in doubt their mandates. And what we see, price dynamics and inflation rate in the past half year shows that it's an open question. And the final answer we will only have in some future. We as Bank of Russia enjoy a classical approach, unlike the European Central Bank. We don't have the need for qualitative easing programs. In qualitative easing, there is a very difficult, challenging question: which assets should be on the balance of the central bank? And the comment of Professor Kemp is very true, that the composition of these assets should be in some sense neutral with regard to the overall equilibrium in the economy. But we are convinced that in the final analysis, the monetary policy should be minimum or produce minimum zero distortions macroeconomically. It should be neutral. When central banks issue money on different terms to different agents or for different assets at different rates, they intervene and go into the fiscal policy. The fiscal policy is developed by the government and approved by elected officials by the parliament. It's only the budget policy, the fiscal policy, that can decide who should bear the burden or the brunt of the cost, like the transition, energy transition, or should get support for its actions, like investment into the greening of the economy. It's only parliaments are authorized and have the right to decide upon the size of subsidies to green projects versus other projects, and what additional penalties should be there for non-green activity, because in essence, a discrimination of non-green borrowers and entrepreneurs may be justified from the point of view of society at large, but still discrimination. And decisions on the size and the scale of this discrimination can only be made by elected parliaments, but not the central bank. Central banks institutionally are not fit and not authorized to make such decisions. Even governments, executive governments, do not make such decisions. It is this parliament who makes such decisions discussing future year budgets. We're talking about monetary policy, and here I will take issue with Professor Kemp. I'm absolutely sure if a monetary policy takes a proactive position on promoting green agenda, that the monetary policy will lose its independence. The parliament will require direct oversight because of redistributive effect. I will fully agree with the previous commentator that it's more likely that the proposed mechanism of economic support for the energy transition should be implemented through subsidies in terms of green instruments or green projects which are released by the government as part of within the framework of decision of parliaments, and do not differ in any way from other structural measures implemented in Russia for some time. For instance, subsidized mortgage programs, agriculture, housing construction, and decisions were made to improve the well-being or food security for the country. This is for them. All these programs are implemented by the government or the executive government. For any subsidized loan, the society is paid by the fact that for others, the average loans are becoming more expensive. The monetary policy should ensure some average terms and conditions for the entire economy to maintain a long-term equilibrium and balance for sustainable growth trajectory and for maintaining targeted inflation rate. And of course, monetary policy should take into account the changes that will take place in the world economy and Russian economy as part of the result of climate change and energy transition. And we should take into account responses and decisions on the budget and fiscal policy that are to be made to reflect such changes and probable changes in the transmissions policy, because modification of instruments mechanism will affect the transmissions to reflect in the macroeconomic forecasts, in central bank decisions, maintaining price stability, even in the context of probably titanic changes. A great many thanks for a very detailed and balanced comment. Now I will give the floor to Professor Alain Paquet, Professor of Economics of the School of Business Administration in Canada, Montreal, Quebec. And there is an important aspect of the balance of interests of various groups, government, central bank, parliament. How do you see this problem and this question of greening monetary policy and any possible special role of the central bank? 5 minutes for you.
Well, thank you very much. Dobry den. Yves, thank you very much for the presentation. I think these are very thought-provoking issues that we need to think outside of the box sometimes. At the same time, and I know you do, we have to recognize the boxes in which we are in terms of some incentives of agents, including that of governments, both the fiscal branch, the fiscal authority, and the material authority. And so I share the same urgency about the situation, about the climate change. As you said, we are changing so important the long-term trend of the economy, and the long term is not in 200 years. It's much closer than sometime we are willing to consider as economic agents, as individuals, and as governments, the same thing. At the same time, if I agree also with you that the black swan, what we used to consider as big black swan events, will be more frequent black swans. It doesn't mean it will happen every year, but I think and some disturbances which will hit all economies, all countries at different degrees, and even different regions of the same country will require important actions in that regard. One question that I have in terms of monetary policy and recognizing all this this urgency is that I think that in maybe one way to think about the issue is that we recognize, I mean, I would recognize that in North America and I think in Europe and possibly all over the world, that fiscal authorities, governments have been tempted sometimes say, well, yeah, there is a problem. Sometimes we'll say, yeah, we talk very loudly about it, and more or less loudly about the issue. And we're certainly slow in terms of acting. And of course, the uncertainty about the size of the effects, the distributional impacts of that may be a cop-out or an easy excuse. Well, we don't exactly know what's going to happen and we're going to wait. Yes, there have been some action in terms of trying to bring, and we need to do more about that, giving the pricing of the externality of pollution, of CO2, and so on. And there have been some initiatives like the idea of a carbon tax or a cap and trade mechanism in order to reflect better the price of the distortion of the externality of pollution and which brings about the climate change. At the same time, I mean, it's easier to talk than to act. And governments have, and the fiscal authorities, and more broadly speaking, the whole government hasn't always been very consistent and maybe not enough, put enough urgency about the situation, even though there are some issues. So in that sense, it's tempting to say, well, monetary policy and central banks may act more quickly because, I mean, in terms of maybe unconventional policies, and I think that they needed to do that. For instance, like following the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, that was brought about in part and mostly in part, but I mean, a significant part from the financial crisis. And and in that regard, the central banks needed to act. I mean, especially we saw that in Europe as well, to act to prevent, I would say, the financial crisis to deepen even more strongly, and it already had hit the economy and the world economy. In the current situation of the COVID era, which we hope will be soon somewhat behind us, but we still have some way to go, obviously. The central bank needed to act as they've done in most countries in order to prevent that on top of the double economic and sanitary crisis that comes up with the COVID pandemic, they needed to act to prevent the financial floor, which is an important pillar of the economy, to collapse. And I think they needed mostly to do what they did. At the same time, and we see some of that now, is that, I mean, that doesn't prevent eventually, even though it seems to have been forgotten in theoretical economic model, as well as practice, that money matters, and money matters for inflation on top of that. So to the extent that the monetary policy will reverse gradually, but fast enough, some of the course they've had to do in the last year and a half or so, I think inflation will remain under control. However, if they lose track of it, I mean, inflation will, without going into hyperinflation in most countries, I mean, inflation will go above 2%, will be 3, 4, 5, we'll see. But I mean, it's still possible to get back. It may be transitory after 1 or 2 or 3 years, possibly. However, what the lesson from the 2008 recession and what I see up to now is I'm not sure monetary policy has been so potent to accelerate the recovery. The recovery was very slow after the 2008 recession, and the recovery has been fast now, and I think it's despite the monetary policy. Even though, as I said, it's important that it acted to have a financial crisis on top of what we were hit with up to now. So in that regard, my question to go back to the issue, because I think it's related, and to which extent is the monetary policy well suited in terms of instruments to act on fighting climate change? I think it is important, at least on one regard, in terms of the financial crisis, the financial risk that has risen quite and will rise again, given the climate change risk that comes with that. That I granted, I have no problem about that. And I think what I read from the Glasgow declaration from the central banks altogether, and I read a recent statement from the Bank of Canada last week, I mean, they recognize that, and I think they are right to recognize that without any doubt. I'm just not as sure that the central bank, even though we understand they can act more quickly and maybe more decisively at first than the fiscal authority on the rest of the government, one risk I think is that if we count too much on those instruments, we don't really know that much about how central banks can do that. I know you proposed some bonus malus mechanism, which I would need to think about with more than I've done up to now. But I'm not quite sure that the instruments of the central banks are well suited, even though it can act more quickly. They're well suited aside, and it's important from financial risk, to act with the shocks that comes with climate change. And I think I would finish with one example. I think one point that was raised by Mr. Alexis Zabotkin from the Central Bank of Russia. I'm not quite sure central banks are well suited to act in terms of distributive effects of policies. I know there are some effects. If interest rates go up, maybe some people who are less, who have more financial constraints are more hit than other people in the economy. I recognize that, but I think the way to correct that is more through proper fiscal actions, more than the central bank's policy itself. And one risk I see is that if we give too much weight to the monetary policy to act on its own on climate change, that will be a cop-out for the fiscal authorities in many countries in the world, including Canada and the United States, to say, well, if we don't do enough, it's not because of us, it's because of the central bank. So there'll be an excuse for the fiscal authorities to take their own responsibilities. So it is, I would think, I would conclude that there is a challenge. How can we design the instruments, the political will and policy will, or to influence this policy will, to act with the more efficient, in a timely manner, to be able to readdress this important energy issues, and we agree totally on that we need to face with the current situation. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much. Because Alain just joined us at a very early hour at his place. It's probably still night there, but after his wonderful speech at the previous meeting, he still joined us today as one of the participants of the discussion. And now I would like to give the floor to Vladimir Drebentsov. We all remember him as a World Bank economist, but right now he is the chief advisor to the CEO of the Russian Energy Agency of the Ministry of Energy of Russia. You have 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Simachov. I would like to say that I'm not going to argue with the position of the central bank. We've already heard it. Let me emphasize a couple of points that I believe quite important. The first point I heard in your presentation, Yuri, and in what Alexei Zabotkin said, is that the climate science has not yet reached a consensus, and therefore we have to be very careful about how to arrive at certain conclusions. I have been following these tendencies. I can't agree with you. After the recent IPCC report this summer, no one representing the climate science would say that there's still a disagreement. So the consensus is that there is a climate change, and the reasons for that climate change are man-made. And here's where I would like to say that it's not just the climate change that is critical for Russia, but we all know that the change of temperatures in Russia are occurring much faster, or at least somewhat faster than in other regions of the world, and we will feel the results of the climate change earlier than the others. And that's what Professor Kemp alluded to in his speech. But I would like to focus in my comments on what follows from the climate change from the climate change battle. It's the energy transition. We've heard this term several times, and this is a key point for Russia, not the climate change, but the policy that will be aimed at fighting such climate change. That's what's going to have a tremendous importance for Russia's economy and the policies of the central bank. That is going to be the key shock we'll have to deal with. after the Glasgow COP, it is clear that China and India have set before themselves carbon neutrality goals, and that means that changes are inevitable. It's the matter of how quickly these changes will occur, what is going to be the nature of these changes. That's where key risks are going to be. And these are the risks that the central bank will have to take into account, among other players. Risk number one is the reduction of consumption of hydrocarbon feedstocks. And for Russia, as the largest exporter of oil and gas in the world, this means a reduction, a fall in export income. Therefore, this is a risk for the payment balance. Plus, we are also one of the most energy-intensive economies in the world. Will this affect Russia's economy? Yes, it will, inevitably. And we need to realize this. And I think the government already understands this. Speaking about climate change and the energy transition, I'd like to draw attention to the fact that the strategy that is aimed at adapting Russia's economy to climate change was adopted by Russia's government 18 months ago. And as for the long-term development strategy for the low-carbon economy, that was adopted just less than, or slightly over 3 weeks ago. That means the level of attention to these issues, and that is changing quite slowly. And the risk here is that if you look at those who deal with the energy transition, you will see that the energy transition is underpinned by technology revolution, or at least by serious technological change. And experts in technology revolutions are saying that there haven't been a revolution in technology in history that lasted for more than 10 or 15 years. We can think that these consequences will not arrive until years ahead. But these consequences, in terms of the need to modernize your economy structurally, these needs might arise quite quickly. And these are the risks that the central bank will have to take into account and be mindful of. And on top of that, since we've already heard the position of the central bank on the neutrality of the monetary policy, which is something that I would not argue with, I would like to emphasize that even Russia's financial institutions are going away from this position. For them, money is something that they view differently. Using the taxonomy approved in Russia, they've already started doing the green financing. And that means that this risk is now on them, and because the central bank is not taking any specialized measures in that regard. The financial institutions of Russia will be bearing that risk, and the risk is quite important because it is associated with the credibility and the solvency of the borrowers, including the largest ones, whose solvency may be called into question very soon. And the borrowers will be the drivers of this energy transition. And the problem with the energy transition is that it is a forced and very quick change of the technology that underpins the fuel and energy market. And as the International Energy Agency has recognized, about half of the energy that will be required for energy transition have not yet reached the market, and therefore there's an uncertainty. One would select one technology and invest in that technology. An alternative energy, for example, solar or wind energy. Others would invest in carbon capture and storage. Who's going to be more competitive down the road? And whether the two of them, or both of them, are going to be solvent, it's not clear. Because technologically and other parameters taken into account, they are not very clear right now. And therefore, I believe that this is where we see some significant risks for financial institutions. And this is what the central bank will have to take into account. Plus, new financial instruments appear. Carbon quotas, they are being traded in Europe. In Russia, there's a law that lays the foundation for carbon unit trading. After the Glasgow decision that finally there will be Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement will be invoked on trading, other problems will arise. How are those climate projects going to be funded? How is the trading going to occur when we trade in the results of such trading. And that is something that the government and the central bank will have to take into account, because private banks, commercial banks, inevitably will be involved in this process. And finally, the last point I wanted to make, because I'm limited in time, I think there is an area for the central bank to play a role on its own, not at the request of the parliament, in terms of monetary policies. We know that one of Russia's major problems in terms of inflation, it's a low observability of the economy, low rates of growth of productivity in the country, which is lagging behind the growth of the money aggregates. And if we look at the next 10 to 15 years, I think for the central bank, it is interesting to answer the question, what is going to be the monetary policy for the next 10 or 15 years? Should it be easy, or soft, to enable this modernization, or whether it would need to stick to pre-existing rules, not to stimulate potentially ineffective rules? I think this topic arises because there is a chance that Russia's absorption capacity, Russia's economy absorption capacity is going to increase, and therefore our policy might change at this. And I will stop here. Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, I know that there are 3 more individuals who wanted to speak. I first want to give the floor to Mikhail Akim. You have 3 to 4 minutes, and then 2 more people will follow. Well, yeah, you've given me the floor late, and now you're limiting me even further. Well, we just had to. Well, thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. Let's look at this problem from a different angle. As a follow-up to what Vladimir was talking, let's talk about definitions and the tasks at hand. The whole speech was about greening monetary policies, and we focused on just decarbonization, because greening is wider than that. That includes water, biodiversity, and other aspects. And for some reason, this has been forgotten, and this has taken the back seat for some reason. On the other hand, one of the key topics at the Glasgow meeting was the greening of projects in emerging and developing countries. This is a very important task, because if we look at the supply chain, we will see that more than 60% of all value added just shifted to emerging and developing countries. All largest companies and corporations that are located in the cleanest regions, such as Europe and North America, they have moved to their dirtiest production facilities to developing countries. And if we are talking about greening projects, and we provide this money to the largest corporation on beneficial conditions, what are we going to green then? Are we going to green the operations of these companies in Germany or in the United States, where the money will go? Or are we going to do this along the entire chain, which is unrealistic in most cases, because this is something that is hard to track in most cases, and in some cases it is deliberately hidden. The other topic we need to study additionally is the topic of what one can consider a proper green technology. As a follow-up to what Vladimir was talking about, let me give you an example. Transition to organic farming. Is this a green technology or not? For organic farming, you need to have more water, more land area, where, for example, forests could grow. Will it be considered to be green or not? That's a big question. Another example is the e-vehicle. Everyone considers them to be green and eco-friendly. But if we look deeper and look at some of the studies that emerged recently, including studies from Volvo, we would see that the carbon footprint of producing an e-vehicle is greater than that of a traditional car. Then you would need to look at the life cycle. What kind of fuel will be used to power those vehicles? Will it be hydropower or coal-fired plant? And this is something that needs to be dealt with before we start deciding what kind of funding will be needed, because this is a problem of greenwashing. It is really quite relevant right now, before we deal with the greenwashing issue and introduce very clear-cut criteria of what one can consider green and what one can consider greening. Before that, it would be difficult to take any action, whatever. Thank you very much. That was a very interesting comment. And now I'd like to give the floor to Oleg Zamulin, who is currently the director of the Center for Macroeconomic Research at Sberbank Corporate University. It is now turn of our financial organizations that are out there at the top level. Oleg, you have the floor. Yuri, thank you very much. I am the director of the Center of Macroeconomic Research of Sberbank, not of the Corporate University. I apologize, I was given a wrong cue then, because these titles sometimes get mixed up. No problem. On the one hand, I would like to say that previous speakers really mentioned what I had planned to say. Nevertheless, I wanted to emphasize a couple of points, which I believe quite important. There are two separate matters that we are mixing up today. One of them is whether the central bank of any country should take the green agenda in its operations, or the green transition agenda, when they make decisions regarding their monetary policies. And there is an answer to that, unequivocally yes, and nobody would argue with that. The second question is whether the central bank should change the principles and rules for executing its monetary policy as a result of this green transition. And this is where I have doubts that such changes to the principles of monetary policies need to be changed. Well, why should this agenda be taken into account? Definitely. As Professor Kemp has rightly put it, the risks are growing, new risks emerge that may have existed before, but they were not as clearly manifested. I'm talking about physical risks, because we are going to be seeing more natural disasters, droughts, floods, and fires. And here's where I would agree with Vladimir Drevensov, who said that the discussion in the scientific community on this topic has basically been drawn to a close. There's a consensus now that the problem does exist. It's a very serious problem. It's an existential problem containing existential risk for the survival of mankind. And these risks are not typical. Usually, central banks fight with the drop in aggregate demand, and you usually respond to this by reducing your interest rates and other methods of monetary stimulus. But natural disasters, they are creating shocks for supply, and you have to respond to them differently. We are going through a major crisis brought about by changes in supply, and we'll have to study the consequences of this for a long time, because standard support measures result in high inflation, and we'll have to take serious lessons from this in order to prepare for future crises that will be caused by climate issues. And in terms of the transition risk, we have the same situation there. Vladimir Drevensov rightly put it that for Russia, we're talking about huge risks, because whole sectors and industries are doomed to lose their position, and we don't know how much they're going to be affected yet. We have to calculate the risks and look at the level of risk associated with every loan that we give out. And for the macro policies and prudential policies, you need to look at the banks' balance sheets and see how susceptible they are to those risks, and whether this is something that can be properly regulated. So in that sense, I don't have any doubts.
With regard to active mitigation policy, reducing those risk levels and reducing the rate of global warming, I will agree with Alexei Zabatkin. This is an issue for the fiscal policy, for the adjustment of taxation. International Energy Agency says $140 trillion until 2050. If the world wants to achieve zero neutrality by that time, that is the price tag. Where do we get this money? Number one is taxation of dirty production. Carbon-related taxes will have to be introduced that will make dirty production unprofitable and more profitable to produce clean products. But such taxes and taxation, any adjusting taxation is the turf of elected politicians that are to make these important political decisions, including subsidizing interest rates as interest rates are subsidized for mortgages. Again, from the point of view of the central bank, I think the main story is assessing the risks for the bank balances. So much for what I had to say. Thank you very much for inviting me. Very interesting and very important discussion. Thank you very much, Alan, for finding time. Now I will give the floor to Vladimir Salnikov. He's from the Central Microanalysis and Long-Term Forecasting. I will not take a risk of giving his exact name of his position. 3 to 4 minutes. I'm from the same center, again, as emotional as I have always been, and I'm emotionally involved. A few minutes, several points. Number one, with regard to the consensus, or just a deliberation, a consensus on global warming. Geocentric system was a consensus-based, but it was not true. And I'm ready to agree that there is some consensus, and I do share it basically in the sense that the warming is there, the man-made influence is there, but there is some subtlety. We do not exactly know the signs. We see significant, maybe dominant, but still, we cannot say for sure that's an exclusively man-made impact. There is some room for cautious statements and propositions. But I noted is that decarbonization and transition is a kind of counter-revolution. It's bringing humanity back in terms of development, the way we have understood this development. Remember that all industrial revolutions were based on the new source of energy, much more cheaper source of energy. Now, decarbonization is entirely different. Everybody is making steps back. I may agree that we have to take a step back to save the planet. But I am myself, Vladimir, but there are so many agents, actors, who will not agree with this. Even more so, majorities will disagree in all declarations, statements about 2040, 50, 2060, no more than declarations. That these guys said something, okay, everybody has started to play the game. It does not mean that all those other people will start saving the planet. End of quote. These are different things and need to be separated. China is pursuing its goals, reducing the environmental load rather than CO2 emissions. China is much less concerned about CO2 emissions than sulfur oxides or CO or nitrogen oxide or particles. They're more concerned about the latter. So far, the energy transition is extremely expensive, extremely costly. Economically, it doesn't pass. To resolve the problem, it's a super technological advance or progress in this area. Whether it will occur or not, there's a much greater uncertainty about this possibility or probability than the impact, man-made impact on the climate. Unless we achieve a breakthrough in energy technologies, this will be so challenging that no one can foresee all the range of consequences and implications rather of it. The Bank of Russia, last point. Neutrality. In Russia, this orthodoxy is characteristic and is very much concentrated in our central bank. Neutrality, the notion of neutrality should be extended and expanded. If, for instance, all the central banks of the world move away from neutrality in this classical sense, if we, as the only central bank, we are left alone, that will sacredly follow the basic principles, conventional principles. I don't know if it's good or not. So let the world disappear, and but principles matter. The notion of neutrality should be expanded and extended and broadened. Neutrality that creates powerful disadvantages. I don't need whether we need this neutrality where the rest of the world is moving away from such neutrality. It's a comment, just a comment. Thank you, Vladimir. I see that Vladimir Jevensov would like to get in again. 2 minutes. But for 1 minute, I will say and express my position. I have noted that the strategy of the energy transition that matters, and to what and why and how fast should we run or move. And we've had it before. Any slogan, very fair, very just, and great slogan. If it's a matter of reallocation of resources in the economy, then there is a group of interest that emerges to make use of, to take advantage of these resources. Is it effective? Is it related to new technologies? Or we should go into what Mikhail Akinin was saying about how it's transparent this will be analysis, an assessment of allegedly advanced technologies and what their footprint will be. I see high risks when there are additional investment resources that are there to be allocated, reallocated. Various kinds of claimants will come. Vladimir Trebensov, 2 minutes, and will then give the floor to the speaker, to the presenter. Thank you, and sorry, but after Vladimir Salnikov and your statement, I can't but say something. I will not repeat about the consensus and climate research. Yeah, it may, an asteroid may not come, but the price of climate change and the implications of it is there. We may not be familiar with the summer report of the IPCC International Expert Panel on Gay Conversion. Look at this report, summary report. The research community relating to this made their statement. There is no doubt about man-made impact. But as I've said, for Russia, it's not just climate change, but the energy transition that matters for Russia. And China, in my view, when we speak about energy transition, we speak about European Green Deal and looking in the wrong direction. I think energy transition will definitely take place, not because Europe wants it, because China wants it. I agree with Vladimir that China is pursuing not only emission reduction goals. China is pursuing 2 geopolitical goals. consolidating its leading position in the world economy. The second, energy self-sufficiency, which is an important, most important geopolitical task. And both tasks are to be resolved through the energy transition, through reduced dependence on fossil fuels, with all the dependence of China on coal economy. Two things to be noted. Vladimir has said that promises are promises, declarations are declarations, doesn't mean that it's being delivered. If you look at the causes of the energy crisis, China, one of the causes of this energy crisis is that the Chinese government is serious about its commitments on reduction. And it turned out that in the second half of the year, many emitters had not been serious. They were reminded that you should be serious about the tasks set by the Communist Party of China with all the chaos and banks that ensued. The second thing, I think China is a country, in my view, which is best prepared for the energy transition. Elementary statistics. Look at the share of China in manufactured e-cars, lithium batteries, and controlling all the strategic materials needed for. China controls 60 to 80% of those components. China is prepared. We are not. If we continue to debate and discuss, we will never be prepared. Now, going back to the missions and tasks of the central bank, we should be preparing ourselves for quick changes. Unless we are ready and prepared, we'll be sorry. And we'll see not only financial, but social economic crisis in this country. Thank you. Thank you very much. We agree that there's a general trend of the global warming is there. I was speaking about something else. A situation where there is a slogan and then we are actively pursuing without actually discussing implications. Okay, it's not the last discussion. I know. I'm not sure that I will agree with the position, enough discussion, we need to act. Yes, we need to act and we need to discuss what is to be done. I give the floor to Uber Kempf. Now sort out, let's debate and discussion. Who is right, who is wrong?
Thank you so much. First of all, the discussion has been quite rich and intensive, and I thank all contributors to it. I think that each of us, each participant or auditor to this session has his or her own view. Of course, we cannot express all of them. Anyway, I think the sample of contributors and comments have been quite rich, and I thank all commentators. I think that in a nutshell, there are, first of all, I have nothing to say about China, and my conference is not on global warming and what we should about global warming. Okay, I stress again, the title of the conference was, I think, clear enough. I have a narrow issue in front of me, what a central bank could do about global warming. How should it react to it? Should it modify its policy? Full stop. I have no more to say on the rest. I'm not an expert on global warming. If I am back to this issue, again, I think that all the remarks, which are very fruitful and well taken, can be put under two headings. The first issue is about the responsibility and the respective responsibilities of policymakers with respect to global warming. The second heading is, as a central bank, the capacity and the mandate to act against global warming once it is recognized, the fact is recognized that there is global warming. The first point on the responsibility in particular of the various authorities and policymakers. I think I said, and I'm willing to repeat here, that I'm not giving the exclusive role against global warming on global warming policy to the central bank. I fully recognize that the major actors should be basically, let's call it the government, and in particular, very broadly speaking, fiscal policy. Okay, that is not to be discussed. Yet, I think that it doesn't mean that the central bank, a monetary policy maker, cannot have its share. How large is its share? We'll see. That's second item. So, about responsibility, as far as central bank is concerned, the question becomes about its neutrality. Okay, is it neutral? Can it be neutral, meaning generating no distributive issues, not playing a role outside its realm, not picking up winners and selecting losers? Okay, is a central bank neutral, and can it remain neutral? Actually, it is not neutral. Whatever de facto it is, when it does not take into account the global warming impact of its action, it is subsidizing, giving favors to high carbon intensive industries. Okay, so for that reason, neutrality is a big issue, and I recognized it I think in my talk and definitely in my paper. Yet, for the time being, we are off neutrality. So, at its place, I think that the central bank can act, is responsible. Full stop. Capacity. Has it a capacity to act? Okay, and on that, I think that, and that is a question asked by Alain Paquet. Yes, it has a capacity to act quickly, but is it well suited to fight global warming? And can it do it without creating distortions? Well, there are basically three ways the central bank can act. Okay, in particular, with respect to global warming. It can use a price system. It can get out the price system and ration credit, allocate credit. Or it can basically create green bonds. That is what I heard from, I think it was Oleg Biogin. Okay. My proposal is to use the price system and not to go beyond that, and not to go into credit rationing, to select winners and losers, to select to whom the central bank should give credit. My system is automatic and is not discretionary because it plays on the price system. The allocation is still made by the price system, just to prices, into interest rates, for example. Okay, there are premiums which are automatically introduced, plus or minus. So there is no selection and no derailing of its major, and which I recognize fully, the major goal of a central bank, which is basically to put it quickly, to fight inflation. It is not because you introduce some premiums into the interest rate, the direct interest rate, that you put in jeopardy your intention to, or your willingness to conduct, anticipate expectations about the inflationary path. So I think that it has a capacity, and it has a capacity to act without creating distortions, without acting discretionarily, and therefore without going beyond its role and acting as a quasi-fiscal player. That's what I had to add. And I think that, I hope that these additional remarks help to understand what I had in mind. I'm perfectly aware of the possible contradictions between the idea that the central bank could play a role against global warming and its other more predominant, okay, I stress in yellow, most predominant missions. That's it. Thank you for listening to me.
Спасибо. Коллеги,
thank you very much. Dear colleagues, we are concluding the session. Great many thanks to Uber Kemp for his presentation, triggering this wonderful discussion. I'm grateful to everybody who came in to comment. I apologize for touching sensitive chords, maybe on issues that are known to everybody, but I have reflected understanding of the issue on the part of some population groups which are far away from climate change issues with regard to any transitions, which we hear declarations. I have some feeling of the need for caution that we should exercise, particularly to the instruments of approach. And what the central bank representative said, there is a risk that when the central bank goes too deep into this policy, that inevitably everybody will start discussing its operation, it will try to influence its operation, with central bank losing its independence. If it become neutral, it's neutral, it's independent. And then we'll see again each other on the 10th of February next year, again, same time, same hour. And I hope the time will fly fast, hopefully without too much care. The presentation will be on industrial policy in South Korea, the experience of government support for heavy and chemical industry starting the 70s. Chun Gen-an. Dr. An is today the chair of the South Korean Commission on Corporate Partnership, in charge of interaction between big, small, and medium enterprises. He's also chair of the board of the Korean Electric Energy Corporation. But before he assumed those positions, Dr. An was an ombudsman on foreign investment, 2006-2014. So he was involved in sorting out and dealing with complaints by foreign investors in South Korea. But starting 2010 and then 2012, he was chair of the Presidential Council on Regulation Reform. I think it's going to be an interesting insight on the Korea's industrial policy. There's so much discussion about it, trying to emulate, but not fully aware of how it is structured and constructed. A great many thanks to everybody. I understand we agreed it will be an hour. It will be then an hour and 15. Now we went beyond an hour and a half again. But the discussion that has emerged, I think, is extremely valuable, and I couldn't stop people. Thank you very much, and all the best to everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you and goodbye.